Welcome to another episode of Mike's Money Picks. Today on the podcast, we're going to be breaking down the Sunday, February 18th slate of college basketball DFS. We've got a nice little 7-game slate on DraftKings as well as a slate on FanDuel as well. And this is going to be one of those longer slates, like it starts at noon on DraftKings and 1 on FanDuel, and it pretty much goes throughout the entire day. So it's going to be a little bit of a grind to, kind of get through. But I do think this is a very interesting slate. All 7 of these games kind of have their little intricacies and little quirks about them. And I do think that there's very interesting ways you can target these 7 games. And I think that how you construct your lineups is going to be super interesting for this Sunday slate. Now, if you are new to the channel, I've had a lot of new people this week. So if you're new to the channel, go ahead and hit the subscribe button on YouTube, as well as subscribe to the audio feed if you're listening on audio. So that way you can get notified when new episodes drop and you can be with us for the rest of college basketball season, all the way up through March Madness. And if you like what we do here on the channel, please hit the like button on YouTube and please rate and review the audio feed as well. I really do appreciate that a ton. And it really does help me out a ton when you guys do that. So when you go do that, just know you have my eternal gratitude. Like, it really does help me out a lot. All right, so we got 7 games to get to. So without further ado, let's go ahead and start breaking down game number 1, Florida Atlantic taking on South Florida. All right, so game 1 of this Sunday slate is taking place in Tampa between FAU and USF. This one is one of the better game environments of the slate, though. KenPom has this one projected to be 76-72 in favor of FAU. FAU tends to play in a lot of these games where the total is in like the mid to high 140s, and so generally speaking, anytime they're on a slate, they're kind of targetable in their own right, but you can also target the team that's going against them because they're not a super locked-in great defensive team either. Now, on the FAU side, John L. Davis is their best player. Like, this has been the case for 2 straight years now. He's only $8,300. I think that he is a supreme cash game play on this Sunday slate. He is their leader in usage. He generally takes a ton of shots. And when you look at what he's done recently, he has hit 4x value for his current salary in 8 of the last 10 games. That's really, really consistent. He only has a ceiling of about like 50 fantasy points, which at a salary of $8,300, you'd prefer it to be a little higher than that in terms of a ceiling. So I think he's in play in GPPs, but I definitely think he's more of a cash play because of his consistency. Now, after him, what I've noticed with a lot of the FAU guys is that they're very dependent on game environment. Like, Elijah Martin is kind of like the wingman on this team. He is the second best player, but like he kind of has some dud games in there where, it's not such a great game environment. Like 29 minutes played, 16 points scored against North Texas where there was only 129 points scored. So really, I think that if you're going to play a lot of these other FAU guys as opposed to John L. Davis, I think you got to include them kind of as a game stack, right? Like, I don't think that they're super intriguing individual plays if you're playing them as a one-off. And Vlad Goldin is probably the one guy I would consider as a one-off play, simply because he is their big man and he does have these random ceiling games. When he plays 30 or more minutes, he tends to be really good, but you never really know when he's going to play 30 or more minutes. So I think he's a guy that if you're playing GPPs has got to be in your player pool, but probably not a guy that's going to be like a core play or anything like that, in my opinion. Now, we've also talked about over the course of the season how the FAU guards are kind of just these like random, like one of them tends to go off, right? Well, the one that's been going off recently has been Brandon Weatherspoon, which probably means that he's probably not going to be the one that goes off Sunday against USF. But if you're anybody that buys into recent trends and recent form, Weatherspoon is the one of the secondary FAU guards who is playing the best right now. Now, on the South Florida side, they've got a clear big 3 in terms of usage between Selton Miguel, Keyshawn Pryor, and Chris Youngblood. Let's talk about Miguel first. So he is their leader in usage, but the problem is that he comes off the bench, and he generally doesn't play more than 30 minutes, which kind of caps his upside. Like, the biggest games that he has are games where somebody else gets in foul trouble, or if he just gets really hot from the field, and he's able to come in and kind of be the hero offensively. And so I think he's kind of a guy you would want to play as a one-off high ceiling type of play, but not like a guy that I'm going to be stacking with other guys. Keyshawn Pryor, I think, is their best player, and he has been supremely consistent in DFS. He played really badly against Charlotte. He kind of couldn't get it out of his own way. He only played 14 minutes, put up 4 fantasy points. But other than that, he's hit over 30 fantasy points in 8 of his last 10 games. And that is a really good level of consistency for a guy at only $7,200. And we have seen bigs have success against this FAU defense. Chris Youngblood is kind of like, he's a weird stat profile in my opinion. He generally takes a ton of shots, but like, he's efficiency dependent. Like, the games where he doesn't shoot the ball well, he doesn't put up a lot of fantasy points. And Also, he's kind of shot dependent. He doesn't really put up a whole lot of peripheral stats in terms of the rebound, assists, and otherwise. And so he's kind of a guy that I'm not going to be playing a whole lot of just because I don't think this is a great profile, and I don't know if he's going to be able to maintain a level of efficiency against FAU that is going to allow him to score a lot of fantasy points. Now, after those three, it's just kind of a mess in terms of usage rate. Like all these guys after them are about even. A guy that I do like is Kobe Knox. He is fourth on the team in shot rate behind those three that I just mentioned. He's taken 19 shots in the last 2 games. That's pretty solid. And he actually has shown a legitimate ceiling. He had 41 fantasy points in a game against Texas San Antonio earlier this season. And so if I'm going to be targeting anybody else on this USF team, give me a guy who I know is going to get shots. Give me a guy who I know is going to play a ton of minutes and I know has a legitimate ceiling. I think he's a pretty solid value play at $5,200. Heading on to game number 2, we've got Purdue heading to Columbus to take on Ohio State. Worth noting, this is Ohio State's first game with an interim head coach as Chris Holtmann was fired earlier in the week. And you never really know what you're going to get out of an interim head coach, right? Is the team going to play really inspired? Are they going to check out? Are they going to start playing different guys? I think there's a lot of variables here with this Ohio State team, and so we don't really know what to expect with them. In terms of the game prediction, though, Ken Pom has this game 79-70 in favor of Purdue. And with Purdue, anytime he's on the slate, you got to talk about Zach Edey, right? On DraftKings, he's sitting up here at $11,000, which kind of seems like an insane price. But it's also kind of not, because even at that exorbitant price tag, he has hit 4x value in 4 of his last 5 games. And the one time he didn't was 42 fantasy points, which is really close to 4x value. And then he also has 2 games of 5x value in those last 5 games. And so, he's just like, he deserves to be priced that high, is what I'm trying to say. He's going to take a ton of shots, he's going to play a ton of minutes, and he's going to score a lot of points and grab a lot of boards. But the problem is, we need him to be in a closer game environment. His dud performances tend to come when, it's a blowout one way or the other, and he doesn't get full minutes load, doesn't get full shot load. Like, for instance, you look at the game against Michigan where he only played 25 minutes and put up 33 fantasy points, or you look at the game at Nebraska where he put up 27 fantasy points, right? Like, we need Ohio State to push this game if we were going to get a ceiling game out of Zach Edey. Now, one thing that's really interesting is, like, you don't see Zach Edey in a whole lot of GPP winning lineups. I think he's a great cash game play, but like, the reason why you don't see him in a whole lot of GPP winning lineups is because he's at such a price tag that, like, there's virtually zero chance he's going to go for like 6x or 7x his salary, right? So I think that, can you play him in GPPs? Yes, obviously. It's very nice to just plug him in and just know you're going to get 40 plus fantasy points out of him. But if you're really playing for ceiling, if you're really playing for first, I don't think that's necessarily a guy that you're going to want to get to a lot, just because, like I said, there's other guys that are priced at like 7 and 8K who can get to 6x and 7x their salary, and Edey does not have that ability. Now, if you do play Edey and you get some value plays that do get to that, then yeah, obviously that offsets it, right? But like, I'm just making a point that, you look back at GPPs, you don't see him in a whole lot of first place lineups. Now, after Zach Edey, Braden Smith has been great for Purdue this season, but like, he is really game environment dependent. He does his best when Purdue is putting up a ton of points, and he's able to put up a ton of points off of it. And I just don't think this is the best spot for him against an Ohio State team that's outside the top 300 in tempo. So I will probably not be getting to Braden Smith either. After that, the rest of the Purdue guys, Lance Jones, Mason Gillis, Fletcher Lawyer, Trey Kaufman-Wren, all 4 of them are going to play a lot of minutes. But like, here's the problem. They're all priced for their ceiling. Have they all had ceiling games in the last month or two? Yes, absolutely. But they're all priced up for it. And so I think if you're playing GPPs, you might want to sprinkle all 4 of them in at some point. But like, you just know, like, you're going to need a ceiling game for them to pay it off. But if they do have a ceiling game, it doesn't matter what their price tag is. So they're guys that do have legitimate ceilings, but probably not the most consistent or most best value plays in terms of points per dollar. That's how I feel about the rest of the Purdue guys outside their big 2. Now, heading to Ohio State, one thing that's been really interesting is that Bruce Thornton has kind of like taken over the team in his last 2 games. All season long, it's kind of been a back and forth between Bruce Thornton and Roddy Gale. Well, recently it's been Thornton. Thornton took a combined 39 shots in his last 2 games, put up 41 and 32 fantasy points in both those spots. So he's been pretty good. If this kind of continues, then you got to kind of like him at a price tag of only $6,900. How you attack Purdue's defense is by jump shooting because you don't want to go into the paint when Zach Edey's down there. And Bruce Thornton is primarily a jump shooter. So I actually don't mind this at all. It's $6,900. I think he is definitely the better play than Roddy Gale, who is kind of taken a back seat to Bruce Thornton and is also a guy who takes more of his shots at the rim. Now, Jamison Battle, I do think is interesting. We talked about him before. He's kind of like this 3-and-D, like perimeter, like wing forward type of guy. And I like Jamison Battle's game. I like him a lot, but like he's been on a really bad shooting slump. And this would be the game that if he finally kicks out of the shooting slump, he's going to have plenty of opportunities to shoot a lot of threes. And he has shown the ability to knock them down. He had 32 fantasy points against Illinois when he was 3 for 6 from behind the arc. So Jamison Battle, I think, is a very sneaky GPP play at 5,800. After that, it's hard to get excited about a whole lot of these Ohio State guys. Royal and Hardman are two guys that are playing increasingly more minutes. They're these young guys that Ohio State's kind of working in. And, maybe as an interim coach, do you try to play these guys more to get them to stay and not hit the portal? Maybe it's a possibility, but I think they're nothing more than like very low price, low owned GPP dart throws. But I did want to get it out there as something to monitor going forward. Next up, we have Northwestern heading to Bloomington to take on Indiana. KenPom has this game projected as 72-70 in favor of Northwestern. Northwestern, the story is that they're going to be without Ty Berry for the rest of the season. They've now played 2.5 games without Ty Berry. One thing that's interesting is that Ryan Langborg was like setting up as an early beneficiary of the Berry injury, taking a ton of shots against Nebraska and Penn State. But then, you have his game against Rutgers. And if you're just a game log watcher, if you didn't watch the game, he was ejected for a flagrant 2 in that game after 10 minutes. And I thought it was a terrible call. I didn't even think it was a flagrant 1. And then all of a sudden it's a flagrant 2. It's just like, what? Like, you're ejecting the guy for this? And so anyway, that kind of puts a little bit of a dent in his price tag and makes him playable because he is definitely an interesting piece without Ty Berry. But what you also saw is Justin Mullins play pretty much his first significant action of the season in that game against Rutgers when Langborg was out. He put up 22 fantasy points. Is that something that's going to continue? I don't know because, again, they are playing without Ty Berry, but they're going to have Ryan Langborg back because he's not going to get a flagrant 2 again. So I think that a lot of people are going to recommend him as a value play, but I just don't think that that's going to be there if Langborg is back in the lineup. But it does merit mentioning because, people are going to look at the game log and see what he did and think, oh, that's just because Ty Berry was out. Not really. It was because Langborg was out. Now, in terms of like how Berry's injury affected the usage, like Brooks Barnhizer, that's a really tough name to say. Brooks Barnhizer has been the primary beneficiary. He has taken at least 11 shots in each of the last 3 games. Now, he's had varying levels of efficiency, but he's also getting a ton of boards and getting some assists and blocks and steals as well. And he's put up at least 34 fantasy points in the last 3 games. At a salary of $7,900 against a not so great Indiana defense, I do like Brooks Barnhizer. And Bowie, the only thing that the Berry injury has really affected him is that he's kind of been down in assists since Ty Berry went down. Like one of the, his catch and shoot guys that he could get easy assists to is not there anymore. So I do think you can still play Bowie, but Barnhizer is my preferred play at the top of this Northwestern side. And then also what you've seen since Berry was hurt, you've seen more Nicholson and Martinelli on the floor together. They're kind of the 2 bigs for this Northwestern team, and they've kind of started playing a bigger lineup with Nicholson at the 5 and Martinelli at the 4. And those 2 guys are playing a ton of minutes. I think from now till the end of the season, if they're going to stay at about $5,000, you can just consider them your cash game staples because they're going to play a ton of minutes. They're going to put up about 20-ish fantasy points. And so if their price tag stays where it's at, I think they're elite level cash game plays at 55 and 5,300. Now heading to the Indiana side, they're interesting because this season has not gone how they expected it to in Indiana, but they still have some guys who have a lot of upside, like Kellel Ware, who's put up over 40 fantasy points in 2 of his last 4. You've also got Trey Galloway, who has been great without Xavier Johnson in the lineup, which, oh, by the way, Xavier Johnson is questionable again for this game. I don't think he plays, but like, he's got that questionable tag on him. I swear the only guy that has the questionable tag on him more than Xavier Johnson is Anthony Davis if you play NBA DFS. But I don't know. If Xavier Johnson continues to be out, I do really like Trey Galloway in this spot against Northwestern. And Anthony Leal would probably play boosted minutes as well. If Johnson's back in, I'm not interested in any of the 3 of them. I do have a lot of interest in Malik Renew, though. He's down to $6,300 because he's had 2 duds in his last 5, but also he had a 48 fantasy point performance against Ohio State. So, like, how many guys on the slate have legitimately had a 6x value game in their last 5? It's not many. Renew's one of them. The usage is still there. If he can stay out of foul trouble, which he couldn't do against Purdue, and he can hit some shots, which he also couldn't do against Purdue, then I do think this is a really good spot for Malik Renew, and that price tag is incredibly juicy on DraftKings. Heading to the last game of this segment, we got Memphis traveling to Dallas to take on SMU. This game is projected to be 79-72 in favor of the Mustangs. Weird how things have kind of flipped, where Memphis was, once one of the darlings of the AAC, and now they're like barely hanging on for dear life. These teams have already played once this season. That meeting was 62-59 in favor of Memphis for only 121 points scored. That's it's not great. Wasn't a whole lot of fancy points scored in that game. David Jones was by far the best player for Memphis in that game. He did put up 19, 9, and 4 on a 36% usage rate and put up 36 fantasy points. He was really the only bright spot for him. But the downside is now is like 36 fantasy points at his salary ain't even going to cut it. So you're going to need him to be better than he was in that game, which he has been lately. He's had 42 fantasy points in 3 straight games. I really do like David Jones. If you're not going to pay up for Zach Edey, I think there's a great argument to be made to pay up for David Jones in your lineup. Now, sadly, the only other Memphis Tiger to hit 4x value in that game was Nick Jourdain. And the crappy part of that is like the Michigan, or I'm sorry, why do I always confuse Memphis and Michigan? The Memphis big man rotation has been kind of a mess recently. Like, you've had Jourdain, Dandridge, and Tomlin play a lot, and now Jordan Brown is back on the team. Like, I just don't really have a whole lot of interest in playing those guys because they're not going to play more than 25 minutes. They're not going to be super high usage players when they're out there. But I just did want to get it out there that Jourdain did have some success in that game. So maybe there is a pathway to either Tomlin, Dandridge, or Jourdain having success in this game. Now, Javon Quinterly is one of the most interesting guys in DFS to me because he has an incredibly high ceiling, but you're paying for that ceiling. So if you're playing GPPs, he's probably a guy you're going to want to get into your lineups because he's either going to help you come in first or you're going to be dead last. That's actually something we say in the Fantasy Corner Discord all the time is first or last, right? He is a definition first or last guy. And what I mean by that is this. Javon Quinterly has been above 5x value for his salary in 2 of his last 8 games, which is not terrible. But in the other 6 games, he has failed to reach 24 fantasy points. That is a little over 3x. So basically, he's either been a dud or he's hit 5x value. So if you're playing GPPs, give him a shot. If you're playing cash games, don't touch him. That's my advice on Javon Quinterly. After that, there's some other guys that will be on the floor, like Jaquan Walton and Jonathan Pierre and the Hardaway brothers, but like they don't really do a whole lot. The guys that are going to be taking the shots are going to be Jones and Quinterly, and then the bigs putting up putbacks. Next up, we got SMU, the Mustangs, and they didn't have a whole lot of success in that game against Memphis either, only putting up 59 points. In fact, the only SMU player to get 4x value was Tyreek Smith. He was able to come through and in only 21 minutes put up 23.75 fantasy points, which is not exactly even 4x, but it's close enough to 4x that I'll give him credit for it. He was the best points per dollar play for SMU in that game. But what I like, though, is that he's playing more minutes now than he was back then because now he is a part of this starting lineup. We have seen bigs have success against Memphis. He's an interesting play that could succeed in any type of game environment. Now, SMU's been on the slate quite a few times now, and we've had this discussion before, but Phelps and Harris are their 2 usage leaders. One of them tends to hit value if SMU gets to like 70-plus points, and so I would tend to play, especially if you're stacking this game, I would tend to get exactly one of them in my lineups. In their most recent game against Tulane, it was Chuck Harris, who went 7 for 12 from the field, 5 for 6 from behind the arc, 25, 4, and 6 for 39 fantasy points against Tulane. Great stat line for Chuck Harris there. But, these 2 guys do tend to kind of alternate good performances. So I think they both have to be in your player pool if you're playing GPPs. And I think they're very easily stackable with either Tyreek Smith or Samuel Williamson. Samuel Williamson is just this power forward who's just a beast of a rebounder who has not been very successful from the field lately. But if he were to be successful from the field, that's a clear path to a lot of fantasy points because he gets a ton of rebounds and he even gets a decent amount of assists and steals as well. After that, the kind of rotational guards for this SMU team have been kind of alternating big performances. Jalen Smith kind of was it like 2 weeks ago. BJ Edwards about a week ago had a big game. Ricardo Wright has also had a few decent games. But Jaheim Hudson has been the guy who's really came through lately. Back-to-back games, he's put up 25 and 19 fantasy points at a salary of only $4,400 in what should be on paper a good game environment. I think he's worth a shot at only $4,400. All right, that does it for the first 4 games. Let's go ahead and take a quick breather, and then let's talk about the last three. The last, not last four, the last 3 games. Next up, we have a battle in the Big East between Seton Hall and St. John's, and this one is interesting because these two teams have already played before. The first time these two teams played, it was 80-65 in favor of Seton Hall, a game that Seton Hall really dominated, which was kind of an unexpected outcome when it happened. But now, like, both these teams look kind of even. KenPom has this one projected to be St. John's 76-70, definitely getting a little bit of a home court advantage there. Now for Seton Hall, Kadari Richmond legitimately has slate breaking upside. It's what he did earlier in the week when he played Xavier with 54 fantasy points. Like, he's a guy that, again, I said it about David Jones, I'm going to say it about Kadari Richmond. If you're not paying up for Zach Edey, he's a guy that you have to consider as your pay up option because he does have legitimate 50 fantasy point upside. He's done it 3 times in the last 8 games. Now, in that previous meeting against St. John's, he had 38 fantasy points, which is not bad, but he was also 4 for 14 from the field, which is not as efficient as he normally is. He also only played 32 minutes, which, like, it could have been like 36-40. So definitely like Kadari Richmond in this spot. Now, I've always complained throughout this whole season about the rest of Seton Hall's starting lineup, Dawes, Bediako, Adewusu, and Dre Davis, how you just never really know who's going to go off. Well, the situation might be a little more clear this Sunday. Dre Davis is very questionable for this game with an ankle injury. And y'all, if you've ever tried to play basketball with a sprained ankle, it's not fun. It's not easy. So I would lean on him not playing in this game. And if he doesn't, to me, that makes things a whole lot more clear in terms of who to target from a DFS perspective. Dre Davis is a great rebounder who plays the small ball 4 for Seton Hall. So you would need more rebounding out of Bediako as well as Dylan Adewusu, who would kind of slide into playing an even smaller ball 4. Also, you would see extended minutes from Isaiah Coleman. To me, that would make Isaiah Coleman one of the premier value plays of the slate. In games that were missed by Kadari Richmond or Dre Davis last game against Xavier, Coleman put up 24, 14, 26, and 21 fantasy points in those 4 games, well over 20 fantasy points per game, well over 4x value for his $5,000 salary. So to me, if we do get news that Dre Davis is out, just go ahead and lock in Isaiah Coleman because he's going to play a ton of minutes and he is going to probably play off value for that price tag. Now, on the St. John's side, this is a very tough team to target in DFS right now. They're kind of going through a lot, and they're kind of switching things up and playing a lot of guys, and there's just not a whole lot of consistency, right? The only thing that's been consistent for this team is Dennis Jenkins. He has been their best offensive player throughout the entire season. He takes a ton of shots, and he plays a ton of minutes, and he's the one guy that, like, is the consistent option for this team. Against Seton Hall earlier in the season, he was good but not great, putting up 29 fantasy points. So if you're looking to stack this game up, he's definitely the guy that I would be going with. Now, this game was also the start of the Soriano and Ejiofor split. What I mean by that was pretty much last season and this season, Joel Soriano had been like a 30-plus minute per game center for St. John's. And the Seton Hall game, he only played 18 minutes, only put up 12 fantasy points. And that's because, for whatever reason, Rick Pitino decided to give a lot of minutes to Zuby Ejiofor, who's been primarily a backup center throughout the entirety of his college career. In that game, Ejiofor played 22 minutes, put up 35 fantasy points. Since that point, they've been really splitting minutes, and it's kind of really eaten into the upside of Joel Soriano. And Ejiofor has also not really had the same ceiling that he has had since the Seton Hall game either. In fact, he hasn't scored more than 20 fantasy points in a game since then. So it's just, it's just not a great situation to target. Like, I can't stress that enough. Like, because they play so many guys and their rotation is so unpredictable, there's just very little you can bank on. Now, the guy that I would say that you can bank on a little bit is Chris Ledlum. He plays a ton of minutes. Usually the Providence game, he only played 23 minutes for whatever reason, but he usually plays a ton of minutes. He usually gets a decent amount of shots up. He feels like, to me, the adult in the room for this team. It seems to me like they have a lot of personalities, a lot of guys who are looking for their own shot. And he kind of feels like the guy who is focused on winning and making winning plays, which is probably why he plays a ton of minutes. So at 6,700, I think he's worth a look, but it's not a great option. This team's very frustrating to play in DFS. Now, heading on to the second to last game of the slate, we've got Rutgers heading to Minnesota. KenPom has this game projected as 66-62 in favor of Minnesota, making it the lowest game environment, or the lowest game total of the slate, making it the worst game environment of the slate. Reason why? Rutgers plays at a snail pace, and they are elite defensively, and they also really struggle offensively. Or do they? Well, Rutgers recently has gotten the addition of Jeremiah Williams. He has played 4 games for this team. He has put up 21, 23, 36, and 36 fantasy points in those 4 games. He started all 4 of them. And he's had over 30% usage rate in 2 of those 4 games. He is instantly their best offensive player and their best shot creator. And he's also going to get you some rebounds and some assists as well. I think that it's $7,200. Like, it's expensive for him, but I think it's a very reasonable price tag considering from the Rutgers perspective, Minnesota is a pace-up spot, certainly more of a pace-up spot than the other teams they played so far. And you know he's going to be on the court. You know he's going to be asked to do a lot and asked to, contribute a lot because he is already their best shot maker. Now, what he's also already done is he's pretty much eliminated the usage for pretty much every other guard on this team except for Derek Simpson. Derek Simpson still does play a lot of minutes. He's not getting as much shots as he used to, though. In the 4 games since Jeremiah Williams got active, Simpson has gone for 38, which was really good. But then since then, 17, 20, and 21 fantasy points. So, these are pretty much the only 2 guards that are playable on Rutgers now because Jeremiah Williams is eating up so much of the usage, and Derek Simpson didn't lose any of his usage. So, pretty much all the other guys at the guard spot are the ones that ended up losing out. Now, I do think this is a really good spot for Big Cliff. He is a very mercurial fantasy player because you never know what he's going to do. But Minnesota is a pretty solid matchup, in my opinion. And 3 of the last 4 games, Big Cliff has put up 33 or more fantasy points. And you got to like that, right? So if he is able to stay out of foul trouble, he legitimately has 50 fantasy point upside, but he has got to stay out of foul trouble. If you go back and look at his game log, his worst games are when he gets in foul trouble. And so if they are able to have him guard Pharrell Payne for Minnesota as opposed to Dawson Garcia, I do think that will allow Cliff to stay out of foul trouble and stay on the floor long enough to put up at least 4x value for his salary. Now, on the Minnesota side, I already mentioned his name already, but Dawson Garcia is their guy. He is their best player. He is their highest usage player. He tends to score a lot of fantasy points. He's $7,800 on DraftKings. Elijah Mitchell is the guy who passes to Dawson Garcia, has a super high assist rate, doesn't take as many shots, but when he's getting a lot of assists, he doesn't need to take as many shots. Here's the problem. Neither of those 2 guys have shown the ability to hit 4x or 5x value in crappy game environments. And this is going to be a crappy game environment going up against Rutgers, who's very slow and very defensive oriented. So, it's nice that their offense is really concentrated around these 2 guys, but it's really tough to target them when you know that they're probably not going to score more than 70 to 73-ish points in this game. Cam Christie and Mike Mitchell have been kind of the 3-point shooting wings for this team. Could one of them get hot and give you really good performance? Yeah, but they're priced up to a point where, again, in a crappy game environment, I just don't think it's a very likely outcome. Pharrell Payne at center, same deal. I just don't think that it's very likely that they give you a big-time performance in a very crappy game environment against Rutgers. Now, the last game of the night is going to be Utah, heading to Pauley Pavilion to take on a UCLA. KenPom has this one projected to be Utah 68-67, which is very interesting to me to consider where these 2 teams have come from this season. Because earlier in the season, Utah beat UCLA 90-44. They doubled them up. You know how hard that is to do in college basketball? They doubled their point total. It's insane. And since then, they've kind of gone in the opposite direction. UCLA has came up from the cellar. Utah is now very much on the outside looking in of the bubble. And so, these 2 teams, it's kind of interesting how, that it was a 46-point gap, and now KenPom has it projected to be a 1-point gap. Well, for Utah, in that first game, Brandon Carlson utterly dominated. He put up 42 fantasy points against UCLA in only 28 minutes played, was only 4 for 11 from the field, so it could have been even worse, right? And he's a guy who's shown legitimate 50 fantasy point upside. He has had 50 and 48 in 2 of his last 3 games, so I really do like Brandon Carlson. I like his upside. I know that UCLA is going to try to muck this game up a little bit, but it appeared that they didn't have any answer for him the first time, so why would they have any answer for him this time? I like Brandon Carlson a lot. I also like Davon Smith a lot because he is a guy, we've mentioned him before, he's a transfer from Georgia Tech who puts up a ton of peripheral stats. He's already had a triple-double this season, and he has these games where he just has insane usage rates in his scoring, assisting, rebounding, and so he has a huge ceiling, and at only $8,100, I think that he is very reasonably priced for his ceiling, right? Like he has had games of over 50 fantasy points this season. So definitely, I've said this a few times this episode, but Smith and Carlson are guys that you got to consider as your pay up options if you're not going to pay up for Zach Eaton. Now, after that, it's really hard to get a lot excited about the rest of the Utah guys because so much of their usage is going to go to Smith and Carlson, and they've also been splitting up the minutes quite evenly as well. Like Keba Keita and Lawson Lovering are pretty much splitting minutes at the 4. Gabe Madsen is playing a lot of minutes at the 2, but like when you have Davon Smith putting up so many peripheral stats, it kind of makes it hard for Madsen. I see him as a pivot play off of Davon Smith as opposed to like a solid, legitimately good play. Then you also have Cole Bajema and Ben Carlson and Hunter Erickson, who are just kind of playing the rest of the minutes out on the wing, but like they're splitting minutes so enough that none of them are hitting 4x value. And in a game environment that UCLA is going to make pretty ugly, it's just not really a situation that I want to target. Now, on the UCLA side, part of what has turned their season around is that they have figured out who their best players are, and they are now running them into the ground. And their two best players are Sebastian Mack and Adem Bona. So Sebastian Mack is their usage leader on the season. He has been really solid lately, 29 fantasy points against Colorado, and that was in a game that only had 124 total points scored. In that previous game against Utah, Mack was 2 for 13 from the field, 0 for 6 from 3, only put up 17 fantasy points, but like, let's just say he was 6 for 13. All of a sudden, that's like 25 fantasy points, and now we're feeling a whole lot better about him, right? So I definitely think he's an option at $6,200, especially considering now we're seeing him play extended minutes with extended usage. Adem Bona is also, playing the 5 now for UCLA. He's been, largely one of their best players with Sebastian Mack. I like Adem Bona in this spot a lot, and he's going to have to stay out of foul trouble, though. He really struggled in that first game against Utah, only played 18 minutes and put up 11 fantasy points, but I really do like the prospects of him for the entire season. And then Dylan Andrews has kind of been the third wheel, been very consistent with his fantasy production, playing a ton of minutes, seeing a steady amount of usage, and I think he's a really solid cash game option at $6,600. Now, the other two guys playing a ton of minutes have been Lazar Stefanovic as well as Brandon Williams. They've kind of been just the rest of the starting 5, and they've kind of been off and on. Like Stefanovic has had his games. Williams has, hadn't really done a whole lot, but like they're playing a ton of minutes. They're going to be out there, and that's been part of their turnaround for UCLA is they've started giving those two guys a ton of minutes, and I definitely think that they are legitimate fantasy options because they're going to be out on the floor. The rest of the UCLA lineup I'm probably not interested in whatsoever. All right, so that does it for the Sunday, February 18th slate of college basketball DFS. Reminder, if you do want more information from me, there are a few places where you can get it. You can follow me on Twitter at Mike's Money Picks. I'll tweet out any updates for the show on there as well, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions on there if you reach out to me. I'm also in the Fantasy Corner Discord. Link is in the description on YouTube as well as on the audio feed. Basically, it is a free Discord. Did I mention free? That is probably, in my opinion, the best college basketball DFS Discord that's out there. We've got a lot of smart people who have had a lot of success in college basketball DFS this season, talking plays, bouncing ideas off each other, and then sweating it out together. It's a blast to be a part of. If you're looking for more people to talk DFS with, I cannot recommend it enough. And we don't just do college basketball. We've also got, golf, NBA, MLB, and other sports going on as well. And it's just a great place to be. And also, if you heard all this information, you want to know who actually makes my lineups, head on over to patreon.com/Mike's Money Picks. I write an article for every college basketball slate on my Patreon, where I profile my core plays as well as my lineup strategy and attack strategy for each and every slate. I'm not going to sit here and guarantee that you're just going to play them and instantly win GPPs. It's not that easy, but I do think that I can help give you some sound, solid advice grounded in data that is going to help you get better and build your own process of playing college basketball DFS. All right, so that does it for this episode, guys. If you like what you saw here on YouTube, please hit the like button. If you like what you heard on audio, please rate and review. I cannot stress this enough. It really does help me out a lot. I really do appreciate it. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel if not already. We're closing in on 400 subscribers, and y'all know I've said before I want to get to 500 before March Madness is over. So the only way we can get to 500 is if we first get to 400. So help me out and hit the subscribe button if you have not already. I really do appreciate it, and you can be with us for the rest of college basketball season. All right, so that does it for this episode, y'all. Hopefully, I will be back for the Monday slate. I'm not going to make any promises, but I do hope to be back for it. So if you're subscribed, you'll know that I'm back, right? So thank you guys for watching and listening to this point. Best of luck to you on the Sunday slate, and I will see you next time.